I'm sorry to tell you that, but your favorite villain is shit, and I can factually prove that to you. Now that I have the attention of you idiots, let's get to the actual topic of this video. Villains and antagonists, we see them everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Some are good, some are just there, and some are actually bad. Yet what do we love about them so much? What makes Darth Vader, for example, so iconic? What is it with these new gen villains and antagonists leading a tragic backstory? And why is Jinga the best villain ever written? All good questions, my dear viewer, let's answer them together. Chapter 1. What even is a villain slash an antagonist? To even begin talking and looking at guidelines or a subjective view, we first gotta solve the most obvious equation. What do we mean by an antagonist or a villain? In usual terms, a villain and antagonist are nearly the same, without fully overlapping though. Small details separate them from each other. A villain is often that evil force doing evil things without good in the heart. A restless bastard hitting a pure kitty on the streets would be a bad person, of course. If he then presents an obstacle to our main cast to overcome, then we have a villain. But be aware that an antagonist is falling into that as well, except the part where he is a purely evil, as the antagonist most often follows a seemingly evil path, yet for a cause he believes is right, or in some cases indeed is a righteous thing. The antagonist also must not strictly be the villain of our main characters. He can also be one of them, a side character developing into an antagonist, or even something like a weekly villain in a 1 or 2 episode story. Most importantly to note is following though, the antagonist goes against the protagonist specifically, hence why the sentence before, since a friend of the protagonist can also be an antagonistic force even though not being evil, as the important part is fulfilled. He becomes a countering force to the protagonist. If you can only remember one thing from this entire video, then let it be this information. But then Raza, can the protagonist be the antagonist like Eren Yeager is, right? Fart no, go into the corner for bad idiots. But really, that is an interesting question though. To answer the last half of the sentence, no, Eren Yeager is not the antagonist. He is and was always and will always be the protagonist of Attack on Titan, but the first half has some weight to it. Generally spoken, it is not possible for a protagonist to be the antagonist, because those two are forces in need of each other, thus they have to exist simultaneously but distinct from each other. If the protagonist becomes the antagonist, then he offers the mantle of protagonist to someone else, basically switching one status for another. If you really wanna know a secret in writing though, come closer to me, come here. Technically it is possible. Mind blown, right? How is it possible though? Well, some media out there indeed used the idea to execute this specifically. Concepts like the evil doppelganger as personality, or even one of the more difficult methods to execute two protagonists, in which one can technically be the antagonist as it would if your story needs to go against the other protagonist. Anyways though, now that we know somewhat what hand we are dealing with, let us dive a bit deeper and see what an antagonist and villain have to bring to the table to be considered good. To emphasize on my points, we will take a look at examples I chose. Some are known and some aren't. Probably not as much, which will lead us to chapter 2, the presentation. Presentation is the part that can go in many directions. As such, we can speak about the presentation overall, including every other aspect in our toolbox like the music, dialogue, helping us to form a frame of what to expect, and those are only a small portions of our tools. But for this chapter I made more face value, which would be the design aspect of our character itself. It isn't a big secret that the menacing appearance does not do its work. It totally works if you design your character to the theme he wants to represent. If we take Darth Vader from the Star Wars trilogy as an example, we immediately get confronted with a cold, dark suit screaming seriousness. By his sheer black color choice alone, we already get a daylight bright statement about our villain, as color choice can play a heavy role in how viewers experience a character. In a typical example of color psychology, black stands for death, grief, power, or evil. Such are attached to its meaning. Primordial fields can be stimulated and a scenario created in the heads of your viewer. If you combine it all with the other tools consisting of music, dialogue, as well as the characters acting, let's say it like that, you create the image your story needs. Music especially is a tool with such great power that can even save terrible scenes from being hated, stemming from the sole fact of it being an overload of emotions focused into a single point. The best examples of good music usage can be discussed far and wide, that is for sure. Yet I personally know of two titles where it stuck with the audience it reached, the Soulsborne series and Metal Gear Rising. In combining boss fights and atmosphere inside the music, we experience a whole other level of immersion. Sound and visuals merge perfectly and deliver a story with impact on our emotions, directing the tone of the scene, depicting itself, for example, with Metal Gear Rising. All of the boss's themes spin its concepts around the actual telling of the story, by being our main source for the antagonist's reasons and motivation to pursue their goals. Most common in them are the emotion and thought, transforming the character over the journey and convey us what they lastly have become. The Soulsborne games, on the other hand, heavily play into that theme or the general concept as well, with the orchestral music residing in a mental or emotional state, many of which soak in agony, tragedy, and a feeling of darkness and failure, feeding, forming an opposing force. Although, be sure, which is a little counterproductive thing for this aspect, do not overuse music. Don't make them the only existence to your character. Mind when and how to use the music, because that can and eventually will lead to your scene getting killed or only exist because of music itself and not the intended emotions of the scene alone. This also applies to dialogue and the choice of your design and the color psychology, as too much can be overwhelming for the viewer. But an aspect you should never hold back on when writing your opposing force is the piece of Feats, which will lead us to chapter 3, Feats. If you're one of those lucky people having watched my Kung Fu Panda analysis, you surely remember me saying something about how Tai Lung's character was mostly raised by the feats he performed in verbal and presentative ways. This is similar, if not the same argument, giving your antagonist / the villain the chance to prove the hype he has around him by physical means. Synchronizing with your audience does more. How often did you hear a villain doing something that was supposed to be the peak of his villainous acts, like he eats babies or some shit, but he never really shown to us, of course understandably why, nor do we ever get something as evil as that ever again. Many authors simply drop this because the area they work in wouldn't allow such violent display of a feat. Other times it just boils down to the fact they think just hearing it is enough, which is a grave mistake, to be honest. Replicability is crucial for this, as the audience has to see your character in its peak to understand the danger and the stakes he presents for us viewers. By past events happened in the character's life merely getting explained to us, we may imagine how it was like, but this is like a friend telling me about that restaurant he visited the last night, where they served that fantastic lobster he talks about. He can describe to you as much of the taste as he wants. Real understanding will only come by sharing the same frame of emotions he had within that moment. As such, the moment of peak your antagonist / villain experiences should be shared to feel the connection to it. Be warned though, like in most cases in life, a striking balance has to be made to be upheld, since repeating the same process over and over again will dull it over time. Repeating the same scenario multiple times will end in the boredom of the viewer, so make sure to know which scene has an importance to be worthy by thinking about the impact it will cause on the viewer and the character itself, of course. The notion of this all coming together into a single character, of course, is probably a bit too much for your small brain anyways. Regardless though, I will present you one antagonist doing this amazingly, and he is from a kids movie, if I'm being honest. And of course I'm talking about Tai Lung. Who else should I talk about? Tai Lung is the perfect example for the right amount of detail and heightening importance, and Feats as a way to measure build up and payoff. I went into a deep dive for him in my Kung Fu Panda analysis, so for a wider explanation is concerned, check it out after this video. From the beginning to the end, Tai Lung is constantly hyped up. This in two ways, of course, verbally and by Feats itself. Constantly hearing about how dangerous Tai Lung is by Shifu and the Five sets the foundation for the story to resolve those statements into Feats, which it delivers with the escape scene in the prison. Filled with the meaning and progression, Tai Lung checks off every box to prove to us why he is feared by Shifu and the Five. Originating from not only Shifu's emotional fear of Tai Lung, but beating the guards and a prison specifically designed for him with huge odds stacking against his escape. Likewise, the way he escapes compressed into a fine package, resolving our expectations using show don't tell. As I mentioned before, us experiencing that peak of his appearance is a very good thing. Ergo, if your scene has no meaning for the opposing force in a structural sense, then you probably should rethink what you wrote there. Of course, it could be you do it intentionally for deconstruction purposes. We can have resolve and answer during the final act or anywhere between, in which you would have a clever way to write your villain as from deconstructing the tool you spread to individual threads to explore and set together newly formed later on. although it requires experience and a certain level of skill depending on the theme you want to deconstruct, so don't overdo yourself. Most importantly though is chapter 4, the impact. Impact is probably the most important aspect of an opposing force, as it regulates how it changes the story and the memorability of its existence. The antagonist and villain can do that in different ways. The category can and should have impact on the story itself and establish the opposing force as a powerful foe. It should be able to change the inner-outer conflict of our protagonist, at the least, be an active force that changes the views of our main character, and sometimes even influence us viewers' opinions, like Stephen Armstrong familiarizing it to many players. And lastly, should not be challenged by the protagonist so easily. Your antagonist and villain are what gives the protagonist their conflict in general. Any easy defeat over them in any regard just makes the credibility of that opposing force very weak. Many stories do hand out the positive side by straight out giving us the so-called force of nature character. This character type is written like a hurricane or a flood. You can insert like anything you know of that is an unstoppable force and see how it changes the surroundings in a literal and story-wise sense. Other stories create an opposing force of great power, so that main cast has to overcome it by strength and ability trained and mastered over the journey. Many stories of course also go less for the actual power of the force, but give him more of a smart piece. This means the opposing force is written as an actual intellectual being, outsmarting and exploiting weakness to gain upper hand, but fighting less. Not that such character can't fight, but it's more of a preferred way than anything else. Very often, stories, especially in DC and Marvel, fuse these two aspects of smart thinker and the powerful brawler together to give their superheroes the brains to be intellectual but still have broken abilities, which often gives out for interesting stories regarding their conflict and how they handle the opponent they have in any kind of story format they write. Two antagonists doing that fantastic though are Jinga from How to Train Your Dragon's Netflix show and probably the best villain ever written, Jinga from the Garo series. But Raza, those two can't be that good, right? Good that you asked, example viewer. I assure you they are, and we will have a look with the compressed explanation about why. If we first take a look at Jinga, I should explain to you who he is briefly. We all know How to Train Your Dragon, but did you know it had a show released for that? Indeed, it covered multiple seasons with many antagonists, and one of them being Jinga. Jinga is that Chat Sigma male that Beta male Grimborn from the third movie wished to be. Jinga was so amazingly written, the writers wouldn't have needed to go that far. It allowed Jinga to not only be built up towards by giving us statements about his feats, but we actually get to see him at his peak many times over. He not only has the influence to change the story in a way, creating conflict in our and for our main cast, essentially mirrors Hiccup and challenges him physically as well as intellectually. Hiccup is a genius for his type. Everyone having watched the entire show can confirm that. So to get an antagonist that not only rivals that intellect, but also surpasses it to a point, Hiccup himself was driven to frustration, ergo challenging the protagonist's beliefs and the development he went through into the seasons prior. While Jinga wasn't the strongest physically, he made it all up with strategy and victory over our good guys on many occasions. The fact that Jinga being a force Hiccup has to overcome by not simply hunting after the idea of just beating him down, and rather has to think outside of the box for his own mind even, presents Jinga as a real threat to our cast. Pinpoint example of this literally being every scene in Race to the Edge show, where the two try to outplay each other in an Elk vs Light fight, or them simply existing in the same frame with dialogue. The dialogue and how the two act around each other naturally builds tension and thin atmosphere as well, giving us the illusion that anytime something dramatic could happen. Lastly, Jing, what? Did you think I'm going to talk about Jinga now? No. You are not ready for it right now. Jinga will be the ultimate example of the video, combining every aspect of the chapters I mentioned so far into a single character. So before we talk about Jinga, we are going to the next chapter, and that is the face of your character. Chapter 5, the personality. How can we then end the video before talking about the face of the character? The personality is one of the most important aspects of your opposing force, otherwise I wouldn't mention it, right? Often, I had watched villains and antagonists in all media to see some peek out by the personality they display in every scene they are in. Those often come by to snatch away the spotlight of the other characters In a good way, of course, just by the way he goes along in the interaction. He or she may often be a charming package wrapped in an evil core. Other times they are written with a lot of trauma weighing their personality, and that reflects throughout that. How to write the personality for your opposing force is up to how your story needs it to be and you want it to be. If you look at Darth Vader again, for example, mainly the movie trilogy, we get a serious and broken Vader taking no bullshit from others, whilst expecting competence at all times. A merciless character without much facade until you research deeper with novels and comics to gain a better understanding of him. Other villains especially share the trait of psychopathic tendencies but the unpredictability factor in their action. With every degree of psychopathic level your character has, the changes of the writer allowing to do more crazy things will not be far-fetched, to be honest. What you have to take care of though, with writing such traits of sociopathic or psychopathic tendencies, is the right dose. Of course this is fiction, and with every factor added not known to our knowledge, things may vary or change in certain aspects, but should always be bound to the logic of the written world and simultaneously giving the reader to understand that you actually grasp the basic understanding of the topic at hand. Anyways, the attribute of the personality is then set. We can have it try to expand and develop it, perhaps by implementing philosophical systems in order for deeper meaning, as popular themes like nihilism, for example, or atheism can be discussed perfectly or deconstructed even with the psychopathic character trait. As such, if you mention the psychopathic character trait, we are coming to our final chapter, which is the perfect example in Jinga. Sure, I could have chosen a popular example for the last chapter, and that would surely be an appetizing thing for the viewers. Yet I cannot much for your shitty hype villains, and I want to educate you on the excellent fine wine taste I hold. So shut up and enjoy it, you filthy casual. Jinga is one of the best antagonists / villains ever written because it fulfills all criteria for a fantastically written character. Starting by his personality being written as a high-end psychopath, he is given the freedom to explore that notion full out and brings the theme of moral nihilism to the table. By the nature of the monsters in the Garou franchise, called horrors, are mostly character of a sin type, but overall represent of negative emotions. Jinga though is no such and lives off the philosophy of nihilism, neglecting value and morally and conceptual higher force for the sole purpose of his own self. He constantly is on a neutral ground, neither angry nor happy, even unclear if he can really feel at all or can only replicate those feelings as he was human before his transformation into an horror. Moreover, his appearance and presentation cover the color meaning by his black suit. As he is representative of the concept of darkness, the suit adds to the aforementioned color meaning of death, power and evil. At the same time, his personality covers that of an intellectual psychopath, constantly shown at his height, combining charming package with idiosyncratic traits. Most noticeable feature though is the way his dimensionality is written as that of the flat character. Not in need to get to the truth the story wants him to see, he already arrived there with his transformation, but changes the world and character around him. Some also consider such character a grey zone between a flat character and a dimensional character, but the full-on dimensional expansion happens later on, or depth and complexity in his trauma as well as his nihilism and conflict structures. You never get a scene in which something happens without meaning with him, and shows off either a personality trait or a progression to the plot, challenging the main character or the main cast in general, and or showcases feats solidifying his hype. Most importantly, on the conflict category, challenges Garou's second-era protagonist Ryuga in his inner, outer, and philosophical conflict by the fact that Jinga was like Ryuga a knight fighting horrors, thus know both sides of the spectrum, submerging in neutrality and challenging Ryuga's youth like that. Jinga forces Ryuga's moral beliefs to shake and reform by being the extreme opposite of his personality and attribute. As Jinga is the darkness, Ryuga as Garou is the light. Thus Ryuga develops a grey zone for himself instead of just being in one tone of evil is evil and good is good. Additionally, the show spends its screen time with both on the field, established that in mind and body Jinga is far superior to Ryuga. Surprisingly going to extreme ways with this, by even going to a grey area where you can debate a scene as being a plateau, but with all the thematic build up to it, it is definitely agreed to be an artistic choice in which to represent that Jinga is indeed far superior to Ryuga and more powerful than him. Having experience and power on his side, Ryuga can't even keep up with Jinga, while still giving the viewer tiny hints that Ryuga progresses in his path to defeat Jinga after his transformation from the death and rebirth stage. The best part is that even then, Ryuga mainly manages to even out the power level and wins by managing to be a second faster than Jinga. No bullshit transformation, no power up out of nowhere, no plot armor, only a fight of two skilled men and only one will live. This enables to hold up the hype over Jinga until the very end of the show. Since nothing was done to damage or outright destroy his reputation, Ryuga earned his victory. A fantastic detail can be found in the scene he appears and how he naturally creates the tension between him and the cast by just playing his personality. Jinga always delivers the fact he is a threat, a danger you can't take on the light shoulder, because your first mistake is your last, should show none. He will make one for you to assure his victory. Lastly, the fact of impact. Having a villain in Jinga that can change the course of the story by taking on the active role to progressing it allows Jinga to tap into the force of nature character type, supporting the madness seeping from him, whilst taking away the spotlight of the other characters whenever he appears. Last but not least, I have to say though, writing an opposing force on this level is no easy task. Depending on how you want to construct dimensionality and your story, you have to do more than just slap a sad backstory to him like many antagonists these days have, to collect their sympathy points. This is no freeway ticket for you to neglect other aspects that will elevate your opposing force to the best version it could be. I understand how that is enough for those riding the emotional rail. They are here for a good time without the need for a too highly developed written force. Of course, if you're happy with this, with the antagonists and villains you share in every spectrum, like good to bad and just the middle ground, I am happy for you. I support it. I am really supporting it and not trying to like frame you into any bad light. Personally for me, I want my villains and antagonists to be actually good. Not in a way they are really complex, but that they are very well written with thought, written with love, so that we indeed can enjoy them like we used to, because many movies these days just don't deliver that. And I was genuinely surprised with a recent example of a fantastic antagonist and Death the Wolf from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. And I hope that many writers, especially in Hollywood, take a fantastic example out of Death and make the antagonist and frame them around what he gives us in alignment to the guidelines of storytelling. Which then lastly will bring us basically to our last part of this video, which will be our conclusion. In the conclusion part, we will go over the chapters and sum them up very shortly, as of course I know your short TikTok brain hasn't probably progressed the information we gave you so far. So let's start with it. Of course, at chapter 1 we have told you that a villain slash an antagonist is slash are mostly the same and differentiate only in small details, like beliefs of pure evil and the twisted justice. Chapter 2 tells us to dive into the presentation of our force by using tools like music, the body language, design and dialogue. Chapter 3 wants you to experiment with the aspect of show don't tell by developing a sense for the importance of a scene and the hype around your opposing force. Make us see him at his peak, connect us and replicate that with chosen, fleshed out scenes with meaning. Chapter 4's impact deals with the changes your force has to have to the world, the story and the characters. Show us what meaning his existence has. Chapter 5's personality is the face of your character, so use it to lure in and capture your audience by not copy-pasting the newest villain in the newest generic show. Give him an idiosyncratic behavior, an interesting aspect of him. Chapter 7, of course, just write a Jinga. Of course, this is a very hard thing. And in the end, though, these are guidelines helping out writers to navigate through the complex landscapes of storytelling, not set rules to never ever have exceptions. And of course, I have not watched every show, read every book or played every game in existence. So I am also just like all of you, just like the pros, learning and going my way with the knowledge I have. And this is as far as we could gather together. Use these knowledges, so I plead of you, use these guidelines to change the cliche into a trope. Include your own twist and give it your best. Find your love for writing and never stop with it. Auf Wiedersehen.